Welcome everybody to this interview with Francine Masiello about her career at Berkeley and some of the things around it, before it, on the sides of it. I'm Robert Kaufman. I teach in the Comparative Literature Department at Berkeley and also in Berkeley's Interdisciplinary Graduate Critical Theory program. And I'm really excited, Francine, to be here talking with you about the scope and the shape of your career at Berkeley. Francine, I think you started teaching at Berkeley in 1977.
Correct.
Until 2017.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into some dates as we go, but I just want to tell the audience that Francine was appointed and taught throughout her career at Berkeley in both the Spanish and Portuguese department and also in the Department of Comparative Literature. She was a mainstay of both departments. She might not tell you that, but the world would. Among her books, all of them prize-winning books, most of them in both Spanish and English, translated into one language or the other after the original in one of those languages or the other, include Lenguaje e Ideología, which was published in 1986. After that, Between Civilization and Barbarism. Included in some of the other works that were also prize-winning and very influential were The Art of Transition, El Cuerpo de la Voz, The Senses of Democracy, most recently Francine's first novel, which was just published last year, The Tomb of the Divers. I hope that we'll have time to talk about all of that. And it's just really a pleasure to get to talk with you, Francine.
Thank you, Rob.
Before we get into your being at Berkeley and being on the faculty, I just feel the need to say an awful lot of people around Berkeley, but around the country and internationally as well, happen to know that you were, and maybe the right way to put it would be famously, a New York City kid, a first-generation American with immigrant parents from a home where the conversation was constantly between or simultaneously Italian and English. And also when you came to Berkeley, all the way across the continent, you seemed to find yourself at home on the exact opposite coast in a somewhat different milieu. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a bit about how over the decades it's occurred to you that that New York City upbringing, that Italian-American family, finding yourself in high school and then at City College of New York, falling in love with studying Spanish literature and culture and history, how that wound up getting you here to Berkeley or getting you here as the person you were when you came here and then further developed into.
Rob, thanks for that question, which is a trick question to some degree because it's a question about origins, right? And it's at this point I can invent a fiction about those origins, but something that is true. If one comes from a bilingual household, it allows us to speak in two tongues, obviously, but also to see the world through a double lens. It was a privilege. I knew things that other kids didn't know, right? It was a wonderful aid in reading because you can, when you're involved in a bilingual, and in my household, a trilingual world because we spoke the Italian dialect, standard Italian and English and some version of some chicken soup in between. That advantage attunes your ear to the world, and it also allows you to listen across the grain. However, in New York of those years, everyone I knew came from a bilingual household. So it was a very exciting moment. I don't want to dwell too long on that background. However, New York in the early 60s was allowed a scenario of new immigrants to the city. The Cuban refugees who came in fleeing Castro's Cuba, who encountered the Puerto Ricans who were looking for economic gain, and lots of Latino voices. So what I took away from high school was that there was no single chord to express the complexity of Latino New York or of immigrant New York in general. And I took that off to college, where of course I became a Spanish major. As my dad used to say, major in Italian. I can't. Well, Spanish is good enough. So this is what sort of started that. And I was very privileged to be introduced in the late 1960s in New York City to the boom writers, that is Garcia Marquez, Borges, Vargas Llosa, who at one time or another all came through New York City, and my very good teachers took their undergraduates to meet these writers. It was an extraordinary moment for a kid, and that pushed me into graduate studies. I wanted to be a Latin Americanist because of my experiences in New York, and I went off to Michigan to begin my career, and it was an interesting moment, not only because of the immigration issues to which I had addressed previously, but also because other things were percolating in the realm of Hispanic literatures. Spanish departments through the 1960s were basically departments of Spanish literature, right? And the add-on was Latin America. And I came in precisely at the moment when Latin America was rising and Spanish studies fell into decline. I did learn some extraordinary things about Spanish studies. There was nothing like the perversions of medieval Spain, nothing like the Spanish Renaissance. If you wanted a great laugh, and also the weightiness of the Spanish crown, right, in every text. And it was the moment of philology for the Spaniards. And I am always indebted to the old philologists because they taught me the art of close reading. Their politics were somewhat different, not necessary for this interview, but there was an amazing operation of sewing together the fragments, shards of information, pieces of texts. I thought it was great. And my thought was, how can we do this in Latin America? But I was still too young to figure out the tools and the routes of access. And I left graduate school as I would say, an incomplete Latin Americanist. I hadn't traveled sufficiently. I had a passion for the archives, but I didn't exactly know how to jump in, okay, especially on the Latin American side. And Berkeley, and then I was offered this job at Berkeley. I should say there's a space in between. I came to the city of Berkeley unemployed, and I was volunteering at La Peña before
I think you had taught in St. Paul, Minnesota at Hamline University as a first job.
That's right. I had a job in Minnesota at a small liberal arts college, and there was not exactly an alignment of aspirations, let us say. And I left after 2.5 years in the 40 below zero and came to California unemployed. My partner at the time found work in the East Bay, and I volunteered at La Peña, which was another game-changing moment. For those who might be listening to this and saying, what the heck is that? La Peña was founded as a Latin American cultural center on Ashby and Shattuck, and the proceeds of the monies drawn into this really fourth-rate restaurant and whatnot were sent to support the resistance movements in Latin America. So my introduction to the question of human rights came not within the university context, but within my volunteer context at La Peña. It started there and it continued through the Argentine Information Service Center, which we set up in Berkeley, which during the time of military governments, in the case of Argentina in 1976, there was a military coup that continued in power until 1983. And in 1976, I was new to Berkeley. And I sought common cause with the Argentines who were organizing the lists of the disappeared. I should say, I had written my dissertation on Argentine literature of the 1920s. So I knew a considerable amount about Argentina, but the stories of disappearances, the stories of human rights violations, of torture cells, hidden clandestine prisons, was something that I learned about in Berkeley. And I carried that project, which for me began in off-campus, into my scholarly work when I was appointed at Berkeley.
Am I remembering correctly that you've told people over the years that fortuitously, although you were already interested very deeply in that human rights question during the eras of the military dictatorships of the 70s and 80s in South America in particular, you weren't yet quite employed at Berkeley. I think you were teaching as a lecturer at San Jose State, but you wound up attending in Dwinelle Hall, which later became your home, where both the Spanish and Portuguese department and comparative literature are housed, attending a showing of Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers. And it was there, I think you had said it was a benefit for Argentine political prisoners being held who had been disappeared or no one knew where they were. And you met some of the Solidarity people that then encouraged you to join that Argentine Solidarity or information network, getting information out. So there was already that Berkeley connection?
That's right. The Berkeley connection brought me together with these people who lived in Berkeley, with whom I still have contact today. I mean, we're all old and trying to resuscitate old dreams in the new climate that we have today. But the important thing was to learn how to work in an organization, which was very ad hoc, right? How to put out a newsletter, how to organize public interest in human rights violations in Latin America. And at a certain point, we decided to go national and not simply be a local operation in the Bay Area. We sent one of our members to Washington to work with Jimmy Carter and Patricia Jerian. Patricia Jerian is very important in the history of human rights in Latin America. And so is Jimmy Carter. A moment here to praise his commitment to fairness and human rights, to his commitment to issues of equality. He sent Patricia Jerian to Argentina to investigate the torture prisons. We, in our Solidarity group, had been reading materials from The Wire, or AP, Agence France Presse, and we knew about these torture operations in great detail. And we were even able to send we knew Patricia Jerian was going to Buenos Aires, and we sent the Carter administration maps of this particular torture prison. Where were the elevators? Where were the stairs? Where were the doors that led to the trucks that would take the prisoners to airplanes so that they could be dropped from the sea? And Patricia Jerian took our maps in pocket, and she was taken to the major torture center and found that there were no elevator shafts, nor was there a staircase, nor was there a back door that would lead to a parking lot for trucks. And she said, "Where's the elevator?" And they were shocked. But we had given her that information. And she came home and she wrote a very detailed report that was important for human rights communities everywhere about the cover-ups in these detention centers, what was and what no longer seemed to exist. And she was very influential in shaping Jimmy Carter's human rights policies, not only in Argentina, but also for Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil. That was the kind of extraordinary work that I fell into. We were able to do something, the printed word counted. I was also writing a newsletter on the economic state of things in Latin America, certainly beyond my reach. But anyway, these were exciting moments that predated my arrival at the University of California, and I want to say they were necessary experiences to make me a better Latin Americanist once I arrived here.
If I'm understanding or remembering in part the timeline, while you're doing that and it's coming to fruition and you're really in dialogue information presenting to Carter's Undersecretary of State was right when you were starting as assistant professor. 77, 78
Those were the years.
was the second year. I'm just wondering what it felt like to you at that moment to be doing that work at the same time as beginning in two departments at once. Could you just say a little bit about what those first couple years of teaching at Berkeley in both departments was like, and doing your research at the same time for what was becoming your first book?
The start of a double life.
Those first years as an assistant professor at Berkeley.
In response to this question that Rob just posed, I think that each of us at Berkeley has lived a double life, our life of books in the humanities and our lives in the community. And my life in the community, in the human rights community, was important to give me a place at the university. But that was only part one. The double life also extended within the community at Berkeley. I was terrified. I was 27 years old, an unformed kid, and there were all of these very serious intellectuals who knew far more than I did. It was a very terrifying first semester in Spanish as well as comparative literature. But I was fortunate to be in two departments at once, and it opened the world to me, not only for literary issues, but for something that means a great deal to me. And that has to do with the question of women's studies and gender studies. I came to Berkeley in 1977, and at the interview moment, Tom Rosenmeyer, a very distinguished Hellenist and who at the time was chair of the department, said, "Miss Masiello, we have a position that we need to have filled. What do you know about women in literature?" I panicked and I said, "Oh, the Lay of Marie de France, the Querelle de Femmes, Sor Juana." Right? Who knew about women in literature? Or at least I knew very little. Well, apparently it was sufficient for me to seize this job at Berkeley, or to be offered this job at Berkeley, because comparative literature, due to the wonderful interventions of the women graduate students, insisted that a course, an upper division course on women in literature, be taught. That was Complet 185, The Image of Women in Literature. And we have the grad students of those days to thank. The women had set up an undergraduate course for the GSIs, which was Complet 40, still running today, but they wanted the new hire to also be teaching women in literature. This changed my life. I never imagined in 1977 that I would write books that had heavy gender components, that this would be important to my life, to my intellectual life and my life outside of campus. But indeed, I learned from the undergraduates, I set that up, and then I opened the doors and realized that women faculty, a few years ahead of me, were gathering in groups, in study groups. They were studying the importance of gender policies in the university. Should there be a maternity leave, a paid maternity leave for women faculty? Should there be a Title IX office on this campus, which slightly later, probably by 1980, Carol Christ was appointed to direct. And she tracked down questions of inequality on promotion cases as part of a mandate of the federal government, Title IX. All of this was taking form when I arrived at Berkeley. June Jordan, in African American Studies, was working with students to form poetry collectives and speak to the community. The senior women in the social sciences, Sue Irvin Tripp, a psychologist, Laura Nader, an anthropologist, Herma K. Hill in the law school, were working on questions of equality for women. And all over the campus there were small groups, some in the humanities, some in the social sciences. People were coming together to push the issue of gender equality, and also the big question: how do we study this in our respective fields? What does it look like if we put the lens of gender over a 19th century novel, no? Which a field that belongs to our colleague Kathy Gallagher. It was an amazing experience to walk into this and say, my heavens, I had never thought about these possibilities. That was only one great discovery at Berkeley. The other was the Berkeley Library. My goodness, it is an amazing thing for a young woman to walk in to the library and see all of these materials, all of these tools, and I discovered that I loved sitting amidst old newspapers and old letters. I guess because I like to gossip. I have to say, I love to put my hands on 19th century letters shared by women in Latin America. I love to read the newspapers and try to put together a city based on what you could read in the newspapers. And this library allowed that. And it, not only did I carry in my lunch pack a great admiration for the philologists, despite some of the shortcomings on the fantasy of the complete work, but I also carried with me the idea that the Berkeley Library would help me out greatly. And as supplements, always as supplements to great questions, at Berkeley, the women faculty were quite consistent in trying to reconstruct a history of women's literature, and books began to appear. There was a marvelous book by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubart, the Mad Woman in the Attic, which reconstructed 19th century from the lens of gender studies. So, oh my goodness, this is extraordinary. And then the question hit me, why don't we have this in Latin American studies? This was like the bingo, million-dollar question, because in fact, there had been no gender studies yet. And this is the other part of my assistant professor enthusiasm, which came from working with the community. I had a number of colleagues in Latin American literature at Stanford, most prominent among them Jean Franco, Mary Louise Pratt, and Kathleen Newman. At Santa Cruz, Martha Morello-Frosch. At Davis, a historian, Francesca Miller. And at Berkeley, my younger colleagues, Gwen Kirkpatrick and Emily Bergman. And we decided to form a study group because we were in fact copying what we saw on had seen on the Berkeley campus. And we started a group together that lasted for close to 20 years. We would meet once a month, and we'd have extraordinary lunches supplied by Andronicos. This was sort of our meeting, our motive for being. But we had the general question, where are the women? Where are the women in the 19th century? Where are the women in the resistance movements in Latin America? Where are the women on the PhD reading lists? There was nothing. So we began to compile bibliographies, to ask questions. Actually, the first book we read was not a book by a woman author. It was The Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig, a queer novel that had been prohibited in Argentina. And we began to think about how to read these books. Where is the key? What secret are we trying to unlock? What kind of language comes along? What kind of language and what kind of critical tools do we need to decipher the language that belong to gendered texts? And we became pretentious also. We called ourselves the SOFA Group. What was it? The Socialist Feminist Alliance. Hardly modest, right? We went to conferences, national conferences. We would all have a table and we would present our research, and the men in our field were horrified. I have a distinct remembrance of a Uruguayan man who stood up at a conference and said to us, "You women are studying Uruguayan women writers, but I want you to know that those women are my friends, so you really have no business putting attention there." There was a lot of this kind of stuff, but we were known, the women on the East Coast, women who were teaching at Harvard and MIT, And several colleges in the Boston area organized to answer our sofa denomination. They formed kama, bed. And I don't know what kama means anymore. It slipped my mind. But we began to circulate, and the idea that Latin American studies under a gendered lens, let's say, was important, circulated and spread. But then, I know I'm straying from my experience at Berkeley, but what I'm trying to narrate is that the study group that was formed in the Bay Area could not have existed without my appointment at Berkeley, because the library put us together. The library, I was pulling things out of our library, things on the stacks that had never been properly filed. First editions by Argentine women from 1860. I found magazines from 1832. La Camellia. There will be no end to barbarism. There will be no civilization in America until we put an end to barbarism in the household. They were playing off the civilization versus barbarism trope that guided so much of 19th century Europe and Latin America. Anyway, we found these materials. The Berkeley Library was extraordinary. Our community was extraordinary. And
I'm so struck hearing you point out these different threads about an additional way to understand discussions in both Latin American studies and comparative literary studies of your work, and of interest that I think never quite stops being expressed, that your first book was really a groundbreaking book about the 1920s Argentinian vanguard poetry in particular, and the way it influenced writing elsewhere in Spanish and to a certain extent in Portuguese, and that the second book then went backwards, so to speak, to the 19th century, civilization and barbarism, and is deeply, deeply and explicitly involved with women's issues. And the rest of the career is largely back and forth between 20th and 19th and even into 21st century materials. And I wonder if you just want to say a little bit more about, maybe it's already all suggested, but I have a sense there's a bit more about the confluence of that work you did and have done as a critic and literary historian, and the nexus of feminist activism at Berkeley, the human rights work, the way that it seemed to you to be impossible to figure all this out without women being at the center or part of the center. And I'm getting the sense too that there's a very special Berkeley component for you about all of that.
Correct. At Berkeley, we were encouraged to wear many hats. And I think every faculty, I can only speak for the humanities, right? But I think every faculty member in the humanities wears many hats at once. The idea that one starts with one text and stays with that one text for an entire career perhaps was an old model. But what I was seeing at Berkeley with people on the street, in the libraries, traveling to archives, organizing students, preparing students. You could work in the 1920s avant-garde and go back into the 19th century. We were all doing this. Everyone was moving at a different pace, but I was motivated by my study group, by SOFA. Everyone picked a topic. From that study group came my book, Between Civilization and Barbarism. It was a women, nation, and literary culture in Argentina, something long and pompous. Mary Pratt wrote Imperial Eyes in that study group. Jean Franco wrote Plotting Women, about women in Mexico. Gwen Kirkpatrick wrote The Dissonant Legacy of Modernism, which was about the Modernista movement in Latin America, focusing on women as well. Emily Bergman began to work on Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. That study group produced amazing energy for these topics, but Berkeley also created that energy because we taught all over the map, and that was something wonderful. I don't know how many courses I invented in my nearly 40 years at Berkeley, and I just I went wild with it. And I think all of my colleagues did as well. It was just a great experience. Your question was, how can we juggle so many balls at once? Everyone was doing it with enthusiasm. I know that we're all faculty members at Berkeley are weighed down by the very extensive committee work. And God spare us the very extensive responsibility of writing letters of recommendation and this and that. And we're all exhausted. But we all liked the juggling of various topics. And our library allowed us to do that. And our colleagues invited us to do that.
A lot of us who have been fortunate to teach at Berkeley for a while, or for even more than a while, are always gratified by the ability to bring people from elsewhere to Berkeley. When you did that, one of the things you wound up doing, in addition to just bringing interesting people, was that it seems as soon as you could, you started having Berkeley be a place that is the Spanish and Portuguese and comparative literature departments, where people still living under military dictatorships who could somehow get a formal invitation were invited to come. And at the moment where democracy began to be restored in some countries, you also, I think, were able to extend longer invitations. I wonder if you can just talk a bit about how you were able to do that, and others who did it with you at Berkeley, and made it a home that I know those of us who've been in Latin America, and people here that we're from Berkeley say, so-and-so and so-and-so was invited when she really needed to not be here, meaning in Argentina, in Chile, wherever it was, and still a dictatorship. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you were involved with that and how it took shape.
Makes me sound like the Red Cross a little bit, and it was not meant. We did manage to invite very distinguished intellectuals from Latin America, because this was part of the Berkeley tradition. Have conversations with people from different campuses, different countries. This is part of the faculty at Berkeley. Has always put extra energy into organizing conferences, visiting professorships. It seemed, I understand that there are some individuals who would say, no, I don't want to be bothered with this. But I think in the humanities, we all tried to open up conversations that would be fruitful for our students and fruitful for ourselves. And on top of it, I needed to contextualize that, Rob, because we were not running a charity operation for destitute Latin Americans. That's not the model we were working with. How can we open these conversations? And also, how can we bring relevant personalities, relevant scholars, to teach us about how theory evolves in Latin America when the scholars are under duress. And I'd like to give one example, and this is pedagogical for those who are listening, and I don't know, perhaps important for the days in which we're living right now. In Argentina, the dictatorship lasted from 1976 to 1983. And as everyone knows, 30,000 individuals disappeared. What may not be quite so apparent is that the universities were intervened as well. And that meant that the faculty was dismissed. Those who remained in the universities were towing the political line, the correct political line of the military dictatorship. But the brilliant minds moved their classes into their homes. And it was very, very difficult. They called these classes years later, decades later, they said, this is La Universidad de las Catacumbas, the University of the Catacombs, because everything was done hush-hush, under the table. The students gathered in the homes of distinguished professors to read Lacan, to read Derrida. I'm saying this with a smile because this is a big risk to follow these intellectual pursuits. No? And these students who emerged from this period in the 70s grew up to be the most distinguished literary cultural scholars whom we have in Argentina today. In this, the distinguished scholars who were teaching these classes in their homes, it was very scary. no one had the phone number of anyone else, because the thought was that if they had been picked up by the police, they would have spilled the beans and denounced their comrades, their friends. We systematically invited, not only at Berkeley, but also Santa Cruz, San Diego, La Jolla, UCLA, we systematically tried to give those scholars a bit of fresh air. And we also wanted to know, we wanted them to share with us, with our students, their way of thinking. There was a brilliant field in Argentina, a brilliant field of literary theorists who emerged actually in the 50s under the banner of Sartre, and they continued, and also they were the first to translate Roland Barthes. Writing Degree Zero appeared in 1952, 53. It was in Spanish in Argentina in 1953. That's sort of the thirst for theory.
And this was the magazine Contorno, and I think one of its founders was your close colleague, not in your departments, not in literary studies, but the historian Tulio Alperindongui.
Exactly,
at Berkeley,
exactly.
Who I gather you did a lot of this work of inviting people during the dictatorship with.
With Tulio. But let me just say about these invitations, we were able, with money from the Center for Latin American Studies, some from the Dean of Humanities, we were able to bring a number of scholars here for a semester so that they could activate their own research, because the libraries were shut down in Argentina, so they could have fresh students and they could teach us. There was a selfish quarter in all of this. Tulio, let me say two things about Tulio for posterity and for this wonderful series on legacy faculty. I guess I have to speak for someone who's no longer with us. Tulio was in the history department. He was the most distinguished Latin American historian anywhere. This was said in Paris, in Latin America, and in the United States. He was a prodigious intellect from Buenos Aires. He came to the United States, to Harvard in 1966 after a smaller military coup. Every time there's a military coup, there's an exile movement. And landed at Berkeley, I think, in 1972. Tulio was very devoted to Argentine, not only the study of Argentine history, but to the study of Argentine culture, literary culture. And he was always in the Spanish department because we wanted to hear from him. He attended classes. He would say at the end, "Hey, Tulio, when we're showing this film today, would you like to come?" Sure. He was basically an adjunct in our Spanish department. And he was very much energized by the thought of bringing Latin American scholars, because he could say, finally, I have a native colleague with whom I can converse. Anyway, so I was maybe the gopher, I think, in those years. But we organized symposia. We made it a project to bring Latin Americans to Berkeley, not only for our personal pleasure, but because there was a real academic need for us and for the visitors. And there was also a political need that we were fulfilling. So those were great moments. I think the late 70s, early 80s, for the expansion of Latin American studies at Berkeley in the humanities, these were great moments, and we were very privileged to have serious scholars visiting us. But Berkeley offered more than that, more than the chance to bring scholars, the intercampus studies, study groups, the possibility of teaching whatever we wanted. That was important. Academic freedom really was important for us to be able to teach whatever we wanted to teach, and that still is there. And the interdisciplinarity, I don't think. Okay, I'll stop for that. I know you have another question.
Well, I was going to say that in addition to the Masiello doing all the work with everyone at Berkeley and bringing people to Berkeley, I want, before we run out of time, to ask Masiello to talk a little bit more about Masiello's writing. And I thought I would just ask first, maybe briefly, about your role as an editor and publisher with others of at least 2 new magazines. You got started, I think they were Feminaria and Mora. And then I want to just, in a final sequence, ask you about how you wound up thinking and feeling your way into the movement during the last few decades, from between civilization and barbarism, into the book on the senses of democracy, the book on poetry, the book about the transition in Latin America, all the way into your own first novel. But let's start with you as an editor of those 2 magazines that you began, and then move into your writing. And I then think we'll be pressed by the wheels of time, the wings of time, or whatever they are.
Okay. Young people have the energy to put magazines together, right? Young people have the energy to sit down at night and knock out 1,500 words on anything. I don't have that energy any longer, I'd like to say. But in the moment, we were able to do that. And in Argentina, there was a North American woman who settled her life in Buenos Aires, who said, there's no work on women in Latin America. This was Lee Fletcher, and she set up the journal Feminaria. And the women in Argentina had their tentacles out in Europe, in France, in the United States. I think they translated Judith Butler into Spanish before Judith Butler had even finished Gender Trouble. They knew. I think it's the thirst of deprivation that encourages young people to reach out and organize a discourse. So I helped them. I don't know about editorial work. I helped, I translated, I published my own work with them. And we also, when we could, we put the money into the pot to support the publication of the magazine. But these were very exciting moments because you could actually produce something that would circulate. Now, and similarly, in later years, Revista Mora came out, which was organized by women in the University of Buenos Aires. Feminaria was organized by poets, by sociologists, people who were working in the public sphere. But Mora was more academic. But again, these women in Argentina put together enormous projects about how to read gender, how they were writing about trans culture way before we were talking about this in the United States. And they did this under tremendous duress. The duress of empty coffers. There's no money for that. Here we could, I think of the cultural products, the journals produced by the University of California. There was money for it. In Latin America, there was no money for that. And one had to sort of figure out how to put things together.
Okay, if it kills me, I'm going to get you to talk about your own writing now.
Oh, okay, and the end of story.
Your award-winning Art of Transition, which is one of the major texts internationally about the role of art at the end of the dictatorship period, but also what it brought to envisioning and beginning to live after that period, has among its blurbs a one from Tulio Alperindonqui, which, as far as I know, the only time in his life he ever evoked Marcuse, and it was to talk about, I'm quoting, you bringing the aesthetic dimension to this very recent, difficult history. You seem to have moved from being close to the bone, really close to the poetry in particular you're talking about in that book, to then a book almost entirely about the strength of form and the body in poetry, to a book on the senses in 19th and 20th century Latin America, and then your novel. I wonder how you felt your way, worked your way, thought your way through those series of extraordinary works. All of them, I'm going to say again, are award-winning, but more than perhaps the awards, they've made dialogues happen in your various fields. I wonder, inside them, what your experience as the person thinking and writing them was.
I think all of the common red thread here is gender. Bodies, women's bodies. Of course, men's bodies came into play, but had I not worked through the materials, the 19th and early 20th century materials I found to organize between civilization and barbarism, which was a book from 1992, maybe. I don't think I could have done the rest. The others led me in different dimensions. How do we speak about bodies? How do bodies withstand the pressure of the market? The art of transition was about the transition from dictatorship to democracy, but it was also the transition from dictatorship to neoliberalism, and that meant the market. And who could stand outside the market? Poets could stand outside the market because the books rarely sell. You can say whatever you want. There was a space that poetry allowed. The language of poetry created interlocutors. And I realized that attention, my attention to poetry, really came from my attention to the work of women writers who also were in search of interlocutors, who were also in search of a communication about oppressed bodies. And that came, and the art of transition was a way to talk about the transition to democracy and to the neoliberal market culture and what happened to the literary world in that way. And I continued that project in the senses of democracy because I came up with this phrase in the middle of the night, and then I owned it, which was, when there's a change of governance, when you go from liberalism to dictatorship, or from dictatorship to market-run cultures of neoliberalism, the discourse on the senses also changes. It doesn't mean that the body changes or the senses change. And I guess I remember that phrase from the 1844 manuscripts, right? Marx is talking about the importance of the senses, right? Exceeds the importance of the thinking mind. We need the senses to work our way in the world, but it changes in different moments. And I was trying to capture that in the senses of democracy. How do these bodies change? I started with the 19th century again. I went to 1802, the arrival of sensualist philosophy in Buenos Aires as a moment governing the formation of the University of Buenos Aires. They started with the French sensualists, and here we are in 2010, and sensualism is claiming its place in critical theory in Latin America, and that was pushing me along. So I think there's a red thread that moves all of this. The novel's another story. Maybe I should save this for part 2 of this interview. I retired, and I realized that there was something left undone. There was another story I needed to tell, which was not the story of Latin America, but it was maybe my story. And I wrote a story, and I'm embarrassed. I'm always uncomfortable about telling my story, so I invented a novel about crooks and thugs and art forgers. This is not my story, obviously. Right? And a family of migrants that goes from the south of Italy to the anarchists, to become part of the anarchists in Paterson, New Jersey at the beginning of the 20th century. And then, about to be deported, my characters go to Buenos Aires where they meet up with other anarchists. So I had characters traveling 3 continents, always in movement, because I didn't think that the immigration stories ever sit still. And it was told also, a story told in multiple voices, because I like to touch the materialism of language, to touch it, to feel it. No, it's just not organizing a sentence on the page. I wanted characters trying to understand other characters with other languages, or someone stutters, or someone tells a joke in Italian which doesn't translate to English. There was a lot of that, but it was also a story about how to tell the story. How original is that? And while my characters were stealing artworks, plagiarizing, copying, I was copying too, but I won't tell you. You have to read it.
Even the brief description you're giving now reminds me that I've been thinking lately, that it feels like one of Berkeley's great calling cards or self-advertisements is not so much come here to be a professor, but come here to eventually become part of the emeriti, because everybody's knocking out these amazing books after they retired. They already had knocked out quite a number of amazing books before they did that, but it looks like the golden place to keep breaking new ground as you retire.
Okay, I think we can say that.
Francine, we're moving towards the end of this, and I really just want to thank you for being so generous with your thinking, your remembering, your articulating what it's been like to be at Berkeley. You're not at the start of your retirement, but you have a lot of time ahead of you, toca madera, and for your own work ahead of you, but also for having been at Berkeley these 40 years, your hopes for what you want to do and what you're hoping for the campus, for the university, its place itself, and as part of networks of intellectual and cultural life.
My hopes for Berkeley. This campus is so marvelous because the faculty really cares about the community that's created. We're talking today, April 3rd, 2025, and it's difficult for universities everywhere, as we know. But I want to talk about the resilience and the compassion and the brilliance of our Berkeley faculty. 2 days ago, a town hall meeting was staged in the law school, in an auditorium in the law school. Faculty was available, faculty members came to ask questions, to present problems, and to have what we might understand as a town hall. Later, the administrators spoke, but let me talk about the faculty for a minute, because it not only reaffirms my good feelings about this magnificent public institution, but also the magnificent people who work here, and our colleagues today are taking care of DACA students. And this came out in the town hall. Our colleagues are taking care of foreign students, protecting them, advising them, housing them. Our students our faculty makes itself available to students, and they believe in the institution, in the public institution, in what used to be the free public institution, and they are ready to fight to the claw for this. And when I heard those words the other day, I probably shouldn't have been there. I mean, they need another retired faculty member there just to sit and observe. But I was so proud of the commitment of our colleagues to the public cause and to integrity and not relenting. And it gives us hope. It gives me hope. I always believed in Berkeley, and right now I especially believe in the public institution. Go blue. Go Bears. What is it? Blue Bears. Okay, there you go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, dearie.